What you see behind me is a typical of what you think of as Jackson Pollock painting. How did he get there? Was he just playing with dripping paint, or is there something more to it than that? Well, would you recognize this as a Jackson Pollock painting? This is a painting that Jackson Pollock did around 1930. I'm not sure we can really date that one. I think the last date I saw was between 1930 and 1935, but what difference does it make? But there's something in this painting. You see, it feels a little bit awkward, but there's something in this painting that we see consistent throughout his work. From this point only to the very end of his life. And that is, look at these lines. You see how he's got all these little gestural moving lines in here? And you see the whole thing feels gestural. As I said before, a little bit on the awkward side, but the whole thing is made up of gesture. You see those gesture lines here? I'm not so sure he didn't do the gesture first. Somewhere I think I probably would read that if somebody knows. But the important thing is not what came first of the lines or the paint. What's important to this is what we see here that later led him towards what we recognize today as being his work. Now this was like in the beginning of the 1930s. That was before I was born. I guess before many of you were born. But then we see about 3 years later, he was doing this sort of thing. Remember when he was working? Now, we usually think of abstract painting. I've heard it many times referred to as modern art. There's nothing modern about it. It's an antique by now. That movement, the abstract movement, was in this era around the early 1900s, all the way through the 20th century to one degree or another. But what I want you to notice about this, he's getting more interested in what's happening over the whole canvas. But what I want you to notice is the movement. Because what we're going to see as we move along on this little journey exploring Pollock, we're going to see this movement, the circular and, well, more circular than anything else, movement in his work. And you can see, even though he's representing here figures, the figures are not important. What's important is the action of what we see going on among the entire set of these figures. Now, as we move to the next piece, this piece was done about 5 years later. Now, what we know about Pollock was that he started out working figuratively, where he would, and many times, he would do a figurative painting, abstracted to the point that we saw that one abstracted. And then he'd come over it and he'd begin to drip or begin to paint swirls and little repetitions of swirls going in various directions, such as we see here. Now some people would look at that and just think it's a mess. But if you look at the action, the movement that's going on in this painting, can you see it moving throughout the whole piece? Just very, very, very busy. Very, very busy. And we begin to see here perhaps a little bit more interest in exploring color. Although we see here it's very subdued in color. But we can see here that he's working within the context of moving away from the figure and towards the action. Now, if we look at the next piece, and this one was done actually it's done the same year, 1945. Now, that's not modern. 1945, I won't tell you how old I was, but I was already born. But 1945, during this time, you see he's playing with that action, that movement. And here you can begin to see the drips. You begin to see that he's working combination of brush work and drips. And if you just allow your eyes to relax into that, you can see some indication of figures. Some indication. You see as you go down in here, and also on this side, some indication that somewhere in there might have been a figure of some sort. So as he moves throughout his lifetime, which is very short, he was killed in an automobile accident in 1944 or 45 during that time. But from this time, when this painting was done, from the rest of his, actually I'm wrong about that date. I think it was more in the 50s, mid 50s. Anyway, what we begin to see here, there was a span of time where it was the movement that he was creating that he became more fascinated with, to the point that he would have these large, huge canvases in his studio floor, and he would work around in a rhythmic motion, and many times people refer to it as kind of a dancing motion, with drips of all different kinds of paints and materials. We won't go into all of that. It's not important. What's important, what I want to emphasize here, is the consistency from the beginning of his work, consistency of the interest in action, in movement, the action of just creating movement on a canvas, nothing else, just movement. Then when we move to the next piece, which is actually more typical of the work we see, recognized as Pollock, we no longer see an image trying to emerge. Here it's just about color and action. He's interested in color, interested in the color only so much as it interprets the action. The dark red oranges we see popping in here were the surface that he was working on. We see some brighter, more yellow oranges popping through in here. And we see a dance, a very fast, convoluted dance taking place here between the yellow lines that we see and the black lines we see. And if you'll notice, the yellows that we see in here are more in repetitions of circles. Do you see all that? Whereas the black feel more, less organized, more spontaneous, where they vary in degrees of width. We can see that it's just a constant drip that's creating the yellow lines as they move along. See, they're all about equal thickness, very little bit in thickness of line. Important thing is that it's the action. And his work was labeled action painting, and you probably already know that. This is what he was interested in throughout his life. Not the images, not trying to reproduce images, but more interested in the action. I said throughout his life. I'm wrong about that. For a great chunk of his life. As he moved on and did many of these really huge action paintings, he began to move back to the figurative again. And we see that here. This is towards the end of his life, one of the last paintings he did towards the end of his life. Look at that. We're going now in full circle, almost like he starts out with the figurative attracting him and exploring the figure, the movement within the figure, within the human figure. And then that sort of emerges and grows into just the movement itself, just the action itself, and then it moves back. And what you see here, if you begin to look, you'll see the representation or the indication in gesture of, you see a figure here, you can see the legs of a figure here, and then if you move on around on this side, you see the figure down here. And so it becomes about shapes and their relationship, but you still see that movement. Very quiet, very much calmer, in terms of its movement and the action. But once again, if you were to just see this painting and not know who did it, you wouldn't know that it was a Jackson Pollock painting, because we have that preconceived idea of just the drips and the circles. And how many times have we heard anybody can do that? Yeah, but here we are again. This is what we think of as Pollock, and now we know how he got there, and then how he tried to leave it. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section, and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com, where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.